Hi everyone, I would like to apologize for being the one here and not having Ingrid. My jokes aren't as good as hers, so please bear with me while I try to make this work. And if Ingrid, you're like listening to this on your plane, we miss you. All right, so awesome to be here with you, James. I'm going to just quickly start off with an intro, just so anyone who doesn't know who you are knows why we're here, and then we can get started. So James Bridle is an artist and writer working across technologies and disciplines. His artworks have been commissioned by galleries and institutions and exhibited worldwide and on the internet. His writing and literature, culture, and networks has appeared in magazines and newspapers, including Wired, Domus, Cabinet, The Atlantic, The New Statesman, The Guardian, and many more. He lectures regularly at conferences, universities, and other events. New Dark Age. His book about technology, knowledge, and the end of the future was published by Verso in 2018, and we're going to talk about it now. Hi, James.
Hey, thanks very much for this. Thank you all for coming. It's really nice to be back.
So I just want to start off with a really straightforward question. Why did you write a book?
So I basically, because I've always wanted to write, and I love writing, and I've always wanted to write about the internet and networks. That's always been like my primary interest. And the strange thing about this book is that I always thought that book would be a really happy one. Like I always thought that I'd write a kind of, incredibly joyful, excited, almost kind of proud book about how extraordinary the internet and technology is. And I got the opportunity to do so in a very weird moment. I was kind of talking and started to think about writing this book, at this particular moment, kind of in the aftermath of the US election and of the Brexit vote in the UK, and just in the world as it is in present, when to write a book that was purely optimism about these systems and networks felt like it would not really be representative of our times. And just that very fact, just the fact that these technologies that I've spent my life obsessed with and excited about and think is wonderful, really felt the need to address the fact that they're not magically producing a better future, which is what naively and I think many of us felt for so long, that this would be this kind of natural outcome of these things. And so this is the result of trying to reckon with that question of these technologies.
So just in terms of like your previous practice and how you kind of got to the book, can we just talk a little bit about like the framing? How did you choose? Because I think the way you kind of like structured the book is actually pretty interesting in how you like pick your different themes. So can you just talk a little bit about the behind the scenes process of like how you got to this sort of framing of the book?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few things that run through it, and obviously it being something that I've written about and thought about for a long time, that I'm writing about in part through the lens of projects I've done over many years. And so there's things in the book that recount stories from several years ago, part of research for projects and so on. And obviously I put them towards the service of this central question, which wasn't necessarily what I was thinking about at the time. But I simply try and approach this question through my own work, through my own experience, and particularly through a couple of lenses. So one of the main framing devices or themes that I kind of return to is questions of the weather and of the climate and of meteorology, which I've touched on in many of my projects, just because it's because the climate as such is an incredibly pressing thing that I don't think it would be remiss to write about the present or the future in this kind of wide-ranging way at the moment without talking about the climate. But also because I've focused on particular... I'll tell two little stories around that, one of which is one of the ways I start to talk about what I call in the book computational thinking, which I can talk about a bit more, is the historical connection between computation and weather forecasting. And weather forecasting for me stands in for how we think about computation in really interesting ways, and how we sketched out what we would do with computers before we had computers, largely based on predicting things. So I talk about how the calculations for working out the weather were like figured out 30 years before we had the computers to run them on. And it was this incredibly exciting moment for people working on them when the computers finally got good enough that they could run ahead of the actual weather. So the first weather forecast I talk about in the book was produced in 1916 with pen and paper, and it took 3 months, right? And the weather had already happened. And it's not until 1950 that John von Neumann and the first massive room-sized computer, the ENIAC, was capable of performing a 24-hour weather forecast in about 23 and a half hours. And that seemed to be like this, that is an incredible moment when suddenly computation runs faster than reality. And prediction becomes possible in this certain way, and with prediction comes control. And that becomes a kind of foundational way in which computation comes to play in the world. And the other, and I tell all kinds of stories about that, but the other way in which this thinking about weather forecasting really played into the book, and even in fact I stole the title for it, New Dark Age, from a piece that was written in the New York Times about 2 years ago by someone who runs one of the world's largest weather forecasting companies, who wrote this like incredibly depressing piece in the New York Times where he talked about the fact that due to climate change, our ability to predict the weather is starting to fail. So we've spent the last 70 or so years improving weather forecasting, getting it out now pretty accurately to like kind of maximized at about 10 days out. You get pretty accurate weather forecasting. But as a result of climate change, the atmosphere is becoming more unstable, less predictable, and the horizon to which we can predict the weather is actually starting to recede again. And in the future, we're going to actually be able to predict less far ahead. And for me, that came to stand in for this whole question of like, to what extent we can predict and therefore control the future, which is like all of our assumptions really about kind of empirical understanding of the world, of thinking the world as something that can be computed and understood in that way.
I mean, that's really interesting, and it actually leads to my next question. In the first chapter, you have a really nice kind of framework for thinking around literacy, like digital literacy and kind of technology literacy, and you argue how simply learning how to code isn't enough, and you kind of need to have like a way of systems literacy to be able to really understand the ways in which technology impacts our life. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah. The systems literacy is something that I don't think I really fully frame as well as I'd like in the book, because I'm still thinking through it quite a lot, and I'm still not quite sure how to phrase it properly. But the point is that I think, and people, I feel that I have, and I feel that other people I know who I feel have, can sort of understand this and slightly better, have a certain understanding of the world that is rooted in not just through thinking through technology, but thinking through complexity in general, and particularly through systems. I feel like I got that understanding, or as much as I have it, through thinking through technology. So I happen to have learned my version of what I think of as this kind of systemic thinking through learning about computers. By which I mean that learning to code, but thinking about the implications of code and computation, gave me a certain literacy in complex systems that I then apply elsewhere. So in other works, I've talked about like the way in which legal systems function, or the way in which climatological systems function, all of which are understandings of complex systems, of which learning to code is like one good way of learning that. You can learn to code without learning any of that stuff, of course, and most of that kind of learning is done uncritically, and it's an interesting question why some people develop a kind of, transferable, complex understanding from doing so. But my argument that I will insist on making, even though it makes it kind of harder to make, is that can't be the only way of learning to think about complex systems. Like there can't just be, because it's such an easy go-to say that like everyone has to learn to code. Like we must be able to see that there's a way of kind of transferring these complex knowledges across disciplines. And ultimately it's really just an argument for kind of transdisciplinary practices, which is to say that like you can learn how to think complex systems in many, many different things, and to say that anyone who has that understanding can speak to a range of things as well. It's so much an argument against thinking in single disciplines and confining oneself to single areas, when what we need more than anything else at the moment is kind of a plurality of voices in all of these disciplines, which again is just to say like you have the agency to speak to these things. Like these are not things that should be restricted to just a few people who claim to have kind of expert knowledge in them.
I mean, yeah, and so I think that's super interesting, and I'm kind of curious, like something that I find interesting from the outside of knowing your work and the book is that you are kind of like this model now of a person who goes into the world, who is critically, like thinks critically, is technically like literate, knows how to talk about this stuff, and has like experience working with it. I'd love to hear just some of your experiences, like being the person who's written this book, who talks to like, who's given a TED talk, and does, and has gone and hung out with like the ultimate solutionists and technical determinists. Where do you find like the tension or like the edges of like the way you wish these sort of systems were taught and talked about versus how the other side, whatever that may be, thinks about it?
Well, I guess this comes down to this thing about that I just said about the people who have like technical knowledge are not necessarily any magically better at thinking through these systems in complex ways. You talk to people who, it's a surprise, and the TED Talk is a good example because I did give a TED Talk, and through that I met a bunch of people who basically run the world or appear to run the world in these quite important ways. They run these very, very large technology companies that we continually think that have and appear to have all of this incredible power, and yet they don't necessarily have any greater understanding of the systems that they're running. And they certainly, I'm also continually struck by their lack of awareness of their own agency. So we often speak of lack of agency as being something that affects people with lesser knowledge or with lesser access or with less who've been kind of historically marginalized or don't have this kind of extra access. But actually, I increasingly find the people at the kind of top of the pile don't really understand they have that agency either, because at all strata they lack this kind of like critical thinking of seeing through the repercussions of what it is that they're making. Again, because of this kind of insistence upon on the one hand, kind of disciplinary, like I work in this discipline, you don't think through the political ramifications of it elsewhere. But also, when you get deep into those systems, you quite easily imbibe this kind of idea of technological determinacy, that it's the technology itself that is doing this, and you're merely kind of aiding it to get there. Which is, with many of these like horrible stories that I tell frequently, I also see as somewhat slightly hopeful as well, because you can take the obverse lesson from that as well, which is that the agency therefore is possible for all of us. Like it doesn't merely reside with those people or with people who have these kind of existing forms of power. That it actually remains possible for all of us to know things and therefore to do things that is impossible for them to kind of imagine or achieve.
So how do you? So I think that's super interesting, right? Because I feel like when you write a book which is called The New Dark Age, a question that I'm sure comes up a lot is, so how do you solve it, right? So in terms of, and obviously like that's a very complicated question with a variety of answers depending on what the actual thing you mean by that is. Where you are positioned now, how do you see, and I know that, for example, like you live in Greece and you spend a lot of your time away from like where a lot of this conversation is happening. What do you see as like the ways in which that's playing out now?
So maybe first to speak towards this like, this question of like how you then position it, given a bunch of these critiques. So you have this like dark, subtitle, The End of the Future, which sounds a little bit like the very bad and kind of neoliberal end of history type argument for things, to say that this kind of whole, that implies a kind of stasis, rather. But what I mean by the end of the future is actually the end of this kind of idea of a computable, knowable, predictable, and therefore kind of controllable future. And like when you take away that idea of the future, a whole bunch of things that are most oppressive in the present immediately become like obviously wrong-headed and stupid. And for example, I talk extensively about surveillance in the book, and show what is really obvious to anyone who studies this. Not only is it like bad in terms of the way it oppresses certain groups and distorts all kinds of things from kind of law enforcement to social relationships, it also fundamentally doesn't work for the thing that it claims to be doing. Like it doesn't function properly. Like surveillance doesn't at the highest level is not an efficient way of keeping people safe, and at the lowest level it's not an efficient way of fighting crime, and all these kind of things. Like, these things fundamentally don't function. And that, again, is one of these things that I see as like hopeful if we're actually capable of recognizing and acknowledging that, both because it forces us to focus on other things, but also it's like a demonstrable lie of those who continue to enforce it. And so what I take from that is like, therefore bringing back these questions to the present, which is actually the domain of action and agency, because it's so easy to be overwhelmed by these problems of the future, essentially, that what is going to happen, and seeing that as something that is wildly out of control. That actually, when you kind of remove that as this kind of constantly oppressive force, as something that's kind of inevitable, you bring it back to what the actual possibilities are in the present. Because we're constantly reinventing what it is that we're capable of doing in the present, which sounds super vague, because I'm drifting towards this kind of solutionism thing again. And one of my real intentions in the book was to not do that, essentially, because I think that desire to provide answers and solutions is part of this kind of future-lining thing that I'm critiquing in the book. But as to what I'm interested in doing now, I think that there is huge amounts of incredible work to be done. I'm really, and that's part of things that I've seen happening in places like IBM and others, people who are taking this work into their own hands, looking at the systems we have and acknowledging the places where they're not working, and not really necessarily appealing to the systems themselves to kind of be better or to fix them, but building kind of genuine alternatives to them, which don't disavow the technologies, but continue to kind of ask, again, what we can make with them. Again, I'm becoming vague again. So I'll say things like the decentralized web. Right? To look at these things at the level of infrastructure and talking about how they're performing now, to look at the things lots of us have been talking about forever, like open source, like owning and controlling one's own data, like really quite simple, basic things when we're talking about technology, but which have never really been pushed to the fore, but are becoming utterly and totally inescapable and inevitable, because the systems that we have built instead of them, that we've concentrated on, are so obviously failing. And that's really what I continue to insist on in the book, is to really lay down very bare the way in which those are failings and insist that we pay attention to them, to make them kind of inescapable, so that we don't have to keep having this argument over which one's going to, which one we should be working on, employing and working on better. And to your question of, which I think was about locality. So I've been living in Greece for the last few years, which I moved to somewhat by accident, but really love it. And it's interesting to see how these things are playing out in other places and the ways in which they're necessary, and to essentially, yes, get oneself out of a bubble of where you think these systems work, because technologies play themselves out very differently in different places, and they have different needs and different expectations. And actually, a better example that I could talk about Greece endlessly is actually Turkey. I was just in Turkey for 2 months, and where a lot of really terrible things are happening, but in which people have an incredible technological literacy in ways that you don't necessarily expect, and that's primarily because of a lot of the oppression they're facing. So Turkey banned access to Wikipedia about a year ago. And it's a very weird thing, particularly as someone who's not used to it, because it's very alive. I mean, we all check Wikipedia or just click that first Google link to Wikipedia on a regular basis. And every time you do that, you get a security alert in Turkey. Not just like a 404 or whatever, but an actual security alert, reminding you that that attempt has been logged. Right? And it feels very present and very visceral. But everyone in Turkey uses VPNs, right? To the point where the Gezi Park protests last year, people were spraying IP addresses on the side of buildings to show you how to access this. And the reason I tell that story is because we think, I don't know, the thing that really struck me was that we spend so much time thinking that these tools are lacking something in their design or our ability to communicate their need, or that they're too complicated for normal people to use. And I just think that people find when they need to use them and are very capable of using them, and can access them and know when they need to to get into these things. And that is happening in other places. Seen mesh networks erected in Athens around for the use of refugees and new communities and this kind. Like these technologies do get rolled out when they're needed, and what I think a lot of possibly us in this room and certainly people who've worked in this space have been doing for years is kind of laying down the duckboards for that thing that we know is going to happen. That is working in the present. It's not knowing necessarily, not expecting these technologies to be taken up and like to sort of revolutionize the world in the moment, but thinking like what infrastructures are going to be useful that we feel we need, and then letting the time come to when they need to get rolled out to everyone else.
So a thing that makes me think about is how like this notion of like truth in data, and how like especially in like Western societies where like everything's very developed. There's like most people have access to some form of computational device, either a smartphone or a computer or something, and just through the amount of data they create, they perpetuate these economies, right? And these economies, and then like, they have these self-fulfilling prophecies of like, the more data you generate, the more money you can make of them, and they kind of skews things in a certain direction, which clearly is not true in the same way in places like Turkey. I know it's not true in places like India. And it sounds like what you're saying is that there's room for like intervention to kind of, to reimagine how these technologies are being used in those spaces. But what do you do when the people who are building it and the way these infrastructures are working are still on the ground? The actual machines that these things are running on are mostly owned by like 5 companies. So how do you deal with that kind of, because the infrastructure that we take for granted now is very hard to actually come by, right?
I'm not sure I have a better answer to that than this kind of continually attempt to reimagine those technologies. And to bring like other voices and other agencies to bear upon them. I mean, you can do this stuff at several levels. I mean, we talked about the YouTube stuff a little bit, which I wrote about in the book and I've written about elsewhere, and watching like the different levels of response to that. Like it's totally valid to take multiple. So this is the thing about the way in which YouTube. You can talk about it in the level of like really creepy children's videos, which are quite extensive on YouTube, or you can talk about the fact that YouTube's algorithms like promote incredibly divisive and kind of sensationalist content, whether it's kind of political extremism or kind of any number of other things, and look at the ways in which it's possible to argue against them doing that and make a noise. And there's like multiple levels of response to that. On one level, there's like simple campaigning about the fact that they're doing it, which can produce changes. So it took almost a year of people yelling, but YouTube changed a bunch of ways in which it presents children videos. For example, they were forced to make changes to their children's app, which relied on human moderation rather than on machine moderation, which cost them loads of money. Like the reason they didn't want to do it was against their business model. At the same level, you can also like withdraw your business from them, and you can work on alternative structures for sharing. Like all of these, I'm not sure if this answers your question, but like all of these practices are valid. All of them require this kind of systemic understanding of how this problem is produced, and that's the bit that gets me interested. Is like how much do you need to understand them to take each of those different actions, and who does it?
Yeah, so one thing that I think about a lot in this context, working especially in the journalism context with this stuff, is I feel like a side gig a side hustle that I'm always doing is performative violations of terms of service, as a way to test the assumptions of why they were written in the first place, right? And I think one of the questions that comes up for me, especially thinking about like the utopianism that kind of comes with the rhetoric around these systems, because what's kind of amazing about technology, especially the way it's like the discourse around it has been for the last 10 or 15 years, is that like it's an easy black box to just put on, like to project and say, hey, this is going to come and fix everything, right? It's like you can project whatever you want, whatever problem you want, and it seems to provide a solution. In the chapter you have on complicity, you talk, just to take in a different direction first, you talk about things like, I have it in my notes, what's the name of the project? Operation Legacy, right? And like in the way, in systemic erasures of history that don't allow you to have the kind of information you need for these to have the systemic understanding you're talking about. So how do you think that we can build that systemic complexity and then that knowledge base while we don't, and obviously explain what Operation Legacy is for people who haven't read the book yet?
Yeah, I mean, Operation Legacy is a very big subject, but Operation Legacy is essentially something that has always been obvious, but has only been proved. Yeah, and actually, this is in itself quite an interesting thing, I think. Operation Legacy was the concerted effort by the British Empire to erase its own history, and it was basically secret for a very, very long time. But as the British Empire, in its previous form, came to a certain kind of end throughout the 1940s to the 1960s and rescinded territories and created independence for its former colonies, there was a concerted effort that was called Operation Legacy to take all of the colonial records and either destroy them or hide them back in the UK. Like, they were put in chests, they were burned, they were sunk in the ocean, and some of them were transmitted to the UK and their existence was denied for the next 70 years or so. Some of those files have come to light in the last decade. A huge number of them are still hidden. They will continue to be destroyed over the past. And there's a couple of reasons that I tell this story in the book. The first is that it's really important to know that we have enemies, because it's quite often quite difficult to talk about this because we get scared of actually really framing this as a fight. And it's important, while we continue to work with these things, to recognize that there's often an adversary, there's an opposition here that does not have one's best interest at heart, whether that's the government in certain actions and forms that it takes, or whether it's tech companies that, for all their ethics departments or their desire to kind of seem good, also have a marketing department which will always, trump their good intentions, because essentially they're goal-seeking artificial intelligence is optimized for profit, and that is what they do. And to keep that framing in mind, I think, is always important. Operation Legacy is like a super extreme example of that. But the other reason I talk about it is because, despite all of that, most of what was done during that period is known, right? The atrocities that were committed, very specific ones, and also the generalized atrocity of colonialism itself, was known. And it's been testified to intensely throughout history by people who suffered from it. But because they didn't have this kind of documentary evidence of it, that's acceptable within the kind of existing courts of law, their testimony was not accepted as being valid, right? And yet it required this release of documents, this incredible work by historians to uncover some of this stuff, to produce the right form of evidence that allowed action to be taken. And again, that's the further reason that I talk about in the book is actually to talk about questions of whistleblowing and technological knowledge in the present, because it's very interesting to me the way in which we've come to understand the systems of technological oppression, primarily surveillance, but other forms as well, that exist in the moment, and what it required for those to be kind of brought to light and brought into public discussion. And what it seems to have taken was the release of the official evidence, right? Like the words of the oppressors themselves being said and made public through this act of whistleblowing. And I have no argument with the Thank you. I have no argument with the kind of individual courage of whistleblowers. I have an argument with their kind of cultural elevation in the present moment as the only domain of action. The fact that we kind of have to sit around waiting for someone who's joined one of these systems to have some kind of change of consciousness and bring it to us when we all know already what's going on. And this is a complicated argument, but it's related to this question of the future and of knowledge and what we can know in the present. And what we're capable of doing without knowing everything. Sorry, we're zooming in and out quite intensely here. But one of these questions of what constitutes a new dark age. The new dark age is not, for me, an age of darkness as an oppressive force. That's not what I mean by darkness. What I mean is like this inability to see in certain ways that we've been accustomed to seeing. And in that particular example, like our inability to know everything. This inability to know like a system in all its complexity, and how we live in a world where we do not know and cannot know everything that's going on throughout the entirety of the system. How you make, ethical and moral decisions within vastly complex systems. Whether that system is kind of governmental or legal systems, or whether it's just this fucking great internet we've built around us, right? Which is constantly presenting us with examples of this complexity and impossibility of defining and understanding everything around us. That's making it visible in kind of every way. Because the way that we're dealing with it now, more broadly, is really, really bad, right? The other, like, foundational question, as I alluded to at the beginning of this, is this essential question of why has the internet not produced a better world? Which is a question of, like, despite the fact that we have access to vast amounts of knowledge, to all of human knowledge, everything we've produced up to this point, kind of at the touch of a button, the world is increasingly characterized by division and fundamentalism, by like really extreme points of view. And those, to me, seem to be reactions to this complexity that we've produced, that we don't know how to live with this multiplicity of viewpoints and possibilities that it produces. That's the whole book in like 5 minutes.
Another thing that I really liked was, I think we talked about it a little earlier outside, but how you mentioned conspiracy theories are like a really good mechanism for people to explain in a simple way the complexity of the world and these technical systems. I find that playing out all the time when people try to, when people claim that that obviously Instagram is listening to what they're saying through their microphone, because how else would they know to serve them this ad? Because the only thing they could have done, only thing they did was say something about that to their friend, right? They didn't, and like, and it's the kind of the beauty of that is that like, we don't know what we do sometimes that these systems are picking up as signals that could allude to that way of thinking. So with that in mind, I'm curious, like, you talk a lot about these this thinking of complex systems and trying to like get a feel for them and kind of acknowledge them. But where do we have agency in them? So like if you're like, I know you have a background in like actually in computer science, I believe, and you've played with these systems at like in a sandbox way, right? And you've built, as you said, your knowledge of complex systems through your kind of your practitioner trying something, it not working, getting a feel for it. How do you give that to people who don't have, how do you give that way of kind of intuition to people who don't have access to that? And as it's going to ever increasingly become more kind of guarded and black boxed. Does that question make sense?
Yeah. I know I talk a lot about agency, which mostly I kind of think of as the kind of permission to act at all, really, or like the self-belief in your ability to do that, which is the kind of first step. But also, as the way you were talking about it, and this is a good thing, I was also thinking that maybe that's not a very good way of thinking about it at all, because it still implies this kind of this like ability to alight on some kind of solution or whatever. And I hope I can't remember to come back to that. But the point was, or that started with this question of conspiracy theory. And the way that I talk about conspiracy theory in the book is, well, particularly I think what Frederick Jameson said about conspiracy theory, which is it's the kind of poor person's cognitive mapping of complex reality. Right, that we constantly, we basically try as hard as possible to make simple stories out of the things that we don't understand. And it's weird, I hadn't even thought about it today, but it's like, I realized what a kind of remarkably childish impulse it is. The most popular thing on YouTube for children are these like unboxing, unwrapping videos, these surprise egg videos. If anyone's got a kid, you'll have seen these. You might have heard about them if you haven't. But they're a particularly popular genre of videos on YouTube where people just unwrap toys for hours and hours and hours at a time. And children get locked into this. It trips something in the wires in a really interesting way. And again, I only realized recently that this is actually like the weaponization of something that's been known in kind of children's psychology and children's television for years. If you watch Sesame Street, or there's another American one called Blue's Clues that used to repeat. I didn't know this one, but all Americans seem to know this one. They used to repeat the episodes. Like, they used to show the same episode several days running because they realized that kids really love repetition. And it's that impulse, which was at that point mostly still being used for kind of educational purposes, that has just been, all these YouTube videos, through this kind of insane natural selection of algorithmic processing, they've just taken that hack, right? Removed all other context and content from the thing and just gone, oh, they like repetition. Boom, ding, 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 ding. You're like, here you go. But the reason they like it is because it's comforting to know what's coming and to feel a sense of control over it, which is what children mostly lack. Also, it turns out what most adults lack, right, is a sense of control. And so conspiracy theory is a way of applying a simplistic narrative to the thing. And when you can tell a story about it, you feel like you have some kind of sense of control. And so if all of us feel like this lack of a sense of control over the world, how do we regain a sense of control without reducing the complexity of the world that is very real? Because the world feels complex and information feels overloading because the world is complex and there is a lot of information. And historically, we've had little access to the sheer vastness of the world because we've been geographically isolated, we've been culturally isolated. And that's less and less the case because of our technological networks, because of travel and transportation, because of all of these things, because of the diversity of our societies. And those are things that I like and would like to keep, right, without everyone going completely crazy as a result. But you can see them going crazy. You can see people rejecting complex narratives through conspiracy theory. You can see them rejecting diversity through nationalism. And I feel those are very related things. And so countering that is the question, is the aim. And so when I frame it as agency, what I get from agency through technology, through learning about complex systems, which I happen to engage through with technological systems, but again, I think there's multiple access points, is not the ability to fix that. I don't want to fix it. I want the world to be complex. I want it to be complicated. I want it to be confusing because it is. What I want to feel is not to feel inherently made unsafe by that feeling, right? To not think of it as something that has to be fixed in that regard, but something that I can actually accept and kind of live with. And this constant question of how we live with complexity and uncertainty is part of it, and not constantly trying to hammer it down into these little boxes, whether those little boxes are conspiracy theories or whether they're databases. And for me, I get that, do that by playing with these technologies or playing with language and writing and trying to write these stories of complexity, which is a thing, again, to bring it back to writing, is I see lots of people trying to do now, watching in kind of literary forms and stuff evolve as we try to grapple with this. It's an ongoing process. The result is not mastery. That's not what I mean by agency. It's not to kind of regain control over this, but it's to regain control of our own feelings about it happening. Yeah,
that's interesting. I mean, there's a lot to think about that, right? It's a... But I guess what it makes me think about, and I think this is going to be my last question before we open it up to the audience, is why should people care, right? And I think I think you like complex systems. I like people in this room probably like complexity because we're all sitting here on a rainy day talking about the new dark age and technology. But a lot of people don't. I always have say this thing when people ask me you write stories about how algorithmic systems discriminate against people, how they can cause systemic bias, blah blah blah. Does it make you do you get happy when people how do people respond to it, right? And what I always find is that people respond with apathy, and for me that's kind of fine. I don't really want to have to I don't want to burden people with the complexity of technology because I think they should if they want guilt and to feel bad. So I guess what I'm going to get at is a lot of people ask me I'm on Facebook, and they feel really guilty about it. It's their fault that they're on Facebook and that they're not supposed to be on Facebook because everyone's told them how bad Facebook is, but they want to stay in touch with their friends, right? That feels like an essential problem. But for me, it's always yeah, cool, but do it. You should feel guilty about climate change, right? Take less planes. Don't worry about using Facebook. But that's a hard thing to kind of unpack and unravel. So how do you find, what are your thoughts on that kind of?
So there's a couple of things in that, I think. The first is that I was incredibly, I mean, who cares about this? Well, I've been in places like this, important places, because there's a lot of people who have no choice about caring about this stuff, and I think that's super important. And basically, I write this and think about this from a position of incredible privilege, where a lot of the things I'm addressed in the book are not necessarily things that super impact me, and that's not a choice that a lot of people have. And I say it kind of fairly early on in the book. I say that, like, this darkness that I'm describing is something that possibly most people actually already like acknowledge and live within and experience on a daily basis, and is not like in any way a surprise to people. And this book is mostly written to convince people who also come from like other positions of privilege, who like are suddenly shocked that technological systems might oppress them, or that there's that there are these systems that are not designed to benefit them. So it's already a fairly narrow kind of road in there. I forgot what the second part was. I'm sorry, totally lost the thread.
That's a perfect way to end this conversation.
Yeah, if I remember in a second, I'm sorry, I'll say. No, I was almost there. What was the rest of your question?
Global warming, like climate change, and like account agency, and like
okay, no, you've terrified me again.
And
the apathy thing and the fear thing. Yes, sorry. That's why that was the second part of what I was going to say. Was this? I don't know. It's just like it's super obvious to me as well. Even though there's people who are aware, the people who claim to be unaware, they are aware. And apathy is not because they don't care. It's because they're terrified. Right? Like, it's because they're frozen in the headlights of what they've just noticed and what you've just told them about. And I don't know, I had another TED story. Like I had an interview this morning with this kind of TED podcast thing. And it was a really interesting conversation because the person I was communicating with, who was super good and super engaged with what we were discussing, could completely acknowledge the challenges of everything that I was talking about. Like, agreed with me about the dire effects of all of these technologies, like in their own life, but somehow could not possibly conceive of making the changes that would actually affect it. And which we just sort of hit a wall in this conversation that we were having. That people were totally capable of acknowledging, seeing very clearly the problems that existed, but incapable of taking like really effectively small actions, like leaving a social media site, right? Or just using it less, right? It's like incredible how, this lack of agency people seem to feel that they have. That essentially. But I don't think that, as I say, that's not a problem of explaining or kind of doing something in a different way. Again, it actually points to the possibility of like how close we are to being able to actually do something about it. But it points to this deep cognitive dissonance that we live within, where we know on like a physiological, neurological level that something is off, and that we're struggling with it, and that the possibility of dealing with that, or the necessity of dealing with that, is becoming inescapable.
Awesome. I think that's a good place for us to stop and take some questions. Thank you very much. I think we have some mics going around. If anyone has questions, you can just raise your hand and we can pass you a mic.
Hey, thanks. This is a really great conversation. I kept thinking about these two words kept coming into my mind that kind of are revolving around this conversation, and those are engineering and design. So when like systems is talked about, right, oftentimes it's in relation to systems engineering, right, which is a discipline of engineering, which is trying to account for complexity of issues and stuff like that. and trying to model those systems to create solutions for them, whether they be infrastructurally based, whether they be database driven, so on and so forth. And the people that go about, right, like tackling this problem or in that field are called designers, right? They like create design solutions for complex engineering systems, right? So I was wondering, my question, I promise I have one. My question is like, how did those two roles, right, fit into this like new darker age, right? The role of the engineer and the role of the designer within producing the complexity of those systems.
I don't know in this particular example what the distinction particularly is between designers and engineers, but there's two things that spring to mind. One of which is that those disciplines have historically been like future focused, like product focused, outcome focused. And it seems to me that the most, I don't know if you can, how this works so much as an engineer, though I'm sure it must, and figuring out how will be interesting. But a designer, and I'm neither of these things, just to be clear, but what the interesting roles of design in present seem to be actually not designing for products and outcomes, but for designing processes and participation, and actually working out how, Keller Easterling talks about this in architecture quite a lot as like designing, I think, what she says, she talks about like designing the stones in the stream, like recognizing that, it's someone who knows them, but I might correct my quote, but that you're recognizing that the things that you are designing are part of ecosystems that shape flows and streams and engage with other things, which sounds a bit vague because it's Keller Easterling, but you're designing part of ongoing processes rather than products, and that to me, and you asked about the new dark age, is about like the actions in the present and how they shape forces rather than trying to like define some particular outcome. But also what the word engineer makes me think of most at the present is I do quite a lot of history telling in the book, and the histories I tell of the internet and computing are quite narrow, and they're also massively male dominated, something I was hugely aware of while telling it, but not being a very good historian, struggled to rectify. And then another book came out at pretty much the same time, which I really love, which is Claire Evans's Broadband, which is history of the women who invented the internet, essentially. And what's really interesting about that book is that all other histories of the internet are histories of engineers. And Claire's book, while it includes several incredibly important engineers, also includes like this whole range of other roles that were involved in defining that. She's really good at expanding the vision of like who invented the internet to people like forum managers, to people who organized and developed standards and these kind of things. And I know it's not quite the question that you asked, but like recognizing the engineering and design, and so it's not necessarily what you're saying, but recognizing the design and engineering are not the only things that shape these, that these are really wide, socially engaged processes that involve a huge number of roles than merely the design and the engineer. And what's great about Claire's book is it really emphasizes ways that those have been, erased from history, partly because they weren't seen so in the world, and mostly because they were performed by women. But to expand that definition of, again, like who has agency in creating these things, I think is really important.
Hey, so I was wondering what you, I feel like after 30 years of internet, we're finally realizing that it is pretty horrible. Internet is bad. And it is something that is, enabling expansive surveillance, making it easier, for a, hyper, consumerist society to function even better, perpetuating, built and perpetuated on these history of imperialism, increasing wealth inequality, I can go on and on, right? So when I think about this, I wonder if if we need to think about like the destruction of the internet and like to mechanisms to look at or like movements, building a movement towards destroying the internet, and going back to 30 years ago, which wasn't that bad, and sure, we will have some awful things that we will have to figure out, but I think we can. And I was just wondering, like, what would you think about? What would you say about a movement to destroy the internet?
I think the internet is mostly just a bunch of Cat5 cables. Like, it's not in and of itself destroying the world, but the applications that we run on it and certain decisions we've taken around routing and all these kind of things definitely affect that. I don't want to destroy it, and I'm deeply suspicious of any narrative that says we need to go back 30 years. Like, we can't like erase history or a bunch of things that have happened, or I think that is an interesting exercise to be done at looking back at previous technologies and saying, like watching where it forked and looking down some of the forks that weren't taken, looking at different architectures for computation, different network arrangements that were tried and for various reasons maybe didn't turn out, and looking at those again. But I think primarily we want to look at, I see some of the things that are being developed now, particularly in distributed technologies, things like DAT and the kind of distributed web technologies. They're new now. They feel like they're encouraging, like again, come back to being like the old, like, it was nice when I was younger thing. But like, what I loved about the early internet was certain forms of community, certain ways that we spoke to each other, certain forms of community that happened then. Those are conversations I feel now I'm starting to have again on the distributed web, where they're not fully public, they're not open to everybody. That's the bit that I'm really enjoying right now, is this idea that everyone will be connected actually maybe isn't what we wanted all along, and that certain forms of distributed web technologies that we're building right now are allowing for smaller, self-defined communities to emerge that are safer and more open, that take advantage of everything across the internet, but define themselves in slightly different ways. So no, I absolutely don't want to destroy the internet, but I think we can definitely build it in certain other ways. I also, can I just say this? I don't know who's got the mic right now, but I would really like to take a question from someone who identifies as female, trans, non-binary, whatever, rather than a man up next. If we could do that, and then we can go back and forth. That would be great. So, here.
I actually, with my whatever comment and questions connected to previous one, I probably know about, I'm sorry, about future more than anybody in this audience. Why? Not because I'm most educated, but because I was born in the time of first space travels in the Soviet Union. And I remember for example, 60s, I remember it was more than 30 years ago, and Soviet Union always was oriented to the future from 1917. And in 70s, I remember the very serious scientists was talking that by 2000, we will be a member of intergalactic civilization, and we will control weather, and everything will be done by robots, and we all will be dancers and poets and artists. And now we work much more. For example, my daughter and her husband working much more than I worked 30 years ago. But my question is, I don't think that it's even in your presentation there is some kind of utopian thinking. And first question is, you're talking about atrocities or something that was done by British government, the British Empire. But what do you think about atrocities that we all make against our nature and our environment? And second question, don't think that we right now live in a time of very present utopia that will be realized by blockchain, a cryptocurrency. What do you think about this? Thanks.
Oh, okay, let's go. Yes, I don't believe in utopias. I think let's not kill the internet, but let's kill this idea of a kind of utopia that's coming down the line, because it's not. We live in a kind of constant struggle and a constant attempt to improve in all the many, many ways that we can. But the belief that this utopia is going to be kind of delivered in some magic way is, it's incredibly destructive. Because it makes us kind of goal-oriented in these incredibly restrictive, computationally kind of optimized ways to try and figure out what is the one secret hack that's going to get us there. And utopia is a kind of, attempt to make a kind of computational hack on the future, to say that there is one kind of optimum state, which is going to be the best one. And that's for me, a result of this kind of, the idea of the utopia is, I think, is one that comes from the same Western Enlightenment thinking, though it's a little bit older, but is connected to it, that has produced this kind of belief that's connected to the idea of progress and constant optimization of the rising kind of curve of Moore's law and everything else, that is driving a lot of our kind of present confusion and present condition. Climate change is bad. Did I mention that? Sorry, just because that was part of your question. Like, yes, we are despoiling the environment, and we're dealing with that, and we're going to have to deal with that. And I do not have the answers to it. I will say, however, that the answer is very definitely not blockchain, which is absolutely and 100% a terrible thing. With pretty much no redeeming features whatsoever, that attempts to replace trust and communication and care between humans with optimized computational systems. And I think there's lots of people trying to do really nice, interesting things with it, with hopefully good outcomes, and I think they're wrong-headed. And I really dislike it quite intensely. As I instinctively distrust any kind of like magical technological solution, but I think particularly distrust that one.
Hi, I just wanted to hear your opinion on the impact of maybe ideological or narrative systems on, on the internet, is it like a chicken and egg thing? Is it the hard infrastructure that impacts the soft, or is it really the narratives and ideological systems that impact the internet itself and how it's designed and how that might impact society?
Are there any particular narrative systems you're thinking of?
I mean, maybe an economic system, for example, like, I guess, capitalism, or maybe ideas of democracy, or like the previous question in, the USSR, and what sort of narratives and stories that might create, that might change the design of systems, because I do feel like things like design and engineering is always sub or slave to an ideological narrative.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is. That's completely inescapable, and I think we have the internet that we have right now because it came of age in it came of age in an intentionally capitalistic time. It also emerged from military systems, and that's its kind of foundationing. Unfortunately, the founding myth and situation of the internet that we've got, which is one of many possible internets, is the military internet. And I think there's the original sin of that is actually its kind of opacity and in its tendency towards secrecy and kind of hiding itself. That it kind of constantly tries to move out of view in certain ways. There's really interesting counter-histories, and I've read a couple of things on this, but I still haven't really got my head around it, but I'm convinced it's really fascinating, which actually is connected to what you were speaking about. There's a book called How Not to Network a Nation, which is a history of Soviet attempts to build networks, which I don't think I fully understood it, to be completely honest, but it really talks about it as like how you try and build a network for a planned economy, like what a network design looks like with a very different kind of political ideology placed on top of it. And it fails for like a kind of bunch of different reasons. Or what happens if anyone seen Alexandra Dominikovich's film From You to Me, .u to .me, which is an artist's film about the history of networks in the former Yugoslavia, when they had their whole own internet going on, right? Because they belonged to the non-aligned movement, and they basically were the non-aligned movement, and built their own, had their entire own computer culture, and were building their own networks, like long before the American internet came and were like, hi, do you want to plug into us? And they were like, no, you can plug into us. Like, we already have these kind of networks built. So yeah, I think there's really demonstrable examples, mostly in history, but also probably in the present, of like other forms networks can take because of these different structures. And yeah, we're conditioned to see, in the present, the internet is something, like it's really hard to imagine the internet without adverts, is like the clearest example of that. But it doesn't need them. Like we can figure out something else, but like it requires telling different stories about the possibilities of it.
Can you hear me? Okay, yeah. Sort of a two-part question. The first, when I saw your book title, it made me think it was part of a trilogy, almost, of Alex Galloway's book, Protocol Control, How Control Exists After Decentralization, and Jonathan Zittrain's book, The Internet and How to Stop It, or The Future of the Internet and How to Stop It, looking at how organizations really control it now, and when they pull the plug, many people are just lost if those networks disappear. And so that's just wanted to know if you thought of those books at all and how it might have thought your thinking into this book. And then the other question is... I haven't read either of those. You haven't read either? Okay, sorry. The other question is your project Autonomous Trap, which is probably one of my favorite projects. I mean, we could talk a little bit about that and how that might fit into some of the theory you're talking about in your book.
Yes, I haven't read either of those books, sorry.
Okay, that's okay.
I mostly read detective novels.
They're about corporations, like controlling.
Yeah. The Autonomous Trap, I don't know, if there's something interesting to say about it in this context, the Autonomous Trap was part of a project of various things I was doing around trying to build my own self-driving car. Because mostly as an exercise in trying to understand neural networks. It was a test case in trying to get to grips with machine learning. And I talk about machine learning quite extensively in the book as an example of a complex system that really nobody understands. It's a real black box, but a decision-making black box that is outstripping human abilities in huge ways, having effects on our lives, making court decisions, beating us at board games, whatever these things are, but like doing very complex things that we don't have access to its decision-making status. And I find it extraordinary, the excitement with which we're pursuing this thing. And so I wanted to understand it, so I was using various kind of machine learning techniques to build a kind of toy self-driving car. But what I also did as part of that process was try to look at ways in which one could interact with systems like a self-driving car without the coding, right? So my usual approach when faced with these technologies is try and work with them and build them myself and gain my agency, as we talked about before, over or around these things by not just understanding how they work, but then kind of working out how else you could design them. So also one of the things I did was I basically built a self-driving car that got lost. But instead of taking you directly from A to B, took on a kind of adventure. Very simple little artistic gesture, but a nice thing, I thought. The other thing I did was design this trap for it. And the trap takes the form of a dashed line and a dotted line in a circle. And in Europe, at least, a dashed line beyond a dotted line means no entry. So when you form a circle of it, you basically form a kind of binding magic circle around the thing from which a vehicle is not allowed to exit. And the critical thing about that, for me, is the two approaches I took in that, right? One of which was this teaching the car to get lost, which is this sort of like, how do we change and make playful and poetic and different the operation of this technology, the self-driving car. And then on the other hand, you have the circle, which is designed to stop it, right? And those are the two approaches to technologies that you don't like, or any kind of force you don't like, which is like to try and manipulate it and take agency over it, but it's also to retain the possibility of just saying like, no, we do not want this. And so the trap is like a super aggressive act in that way, but it's also a moment of, it was also intended as a point of negotiation, right? Because the trap, these lines on the ground, are something which humans can see, but the machine can see as well. And what I was seeking as these like technologies inevitably evolve, right? And machine learning, whether it evolves like crazy full consciousness, like Elon Musk AI, whatever. The point is, it's going to become incredibly powerful. Corporations are AI; they already exist. It happens. Like, where's the shared space in which we can have a meaningful conversation with these things, negotiate with them? And so, what the search trap, as well as like a no sign, is also this like shared space, like where the human and the machine are like seeing the same thing and therefore have something to talk about. Right? It's the generation of an object or a model that we can both perceive and therefore have a meaningful conversation about, which is often what I think these works that kind of demonstrate visibility or whatever are doing. They're kind of pulling into space a common object over which like a discussion is possible, rather than saying like, you know, you don't understand this, or this is kind of beyond your understanding. And that's what I'm doing.
Question.
We got a couple
over here. Sure.
So, yeah, the question is, there's this really interesting dilemma in the talk, I think, which was about how predictive systems, the rational, the objective, which we'd relied on so long, and have finally, in a sense, become democratized in the sense of using Google Maps to know exactly what minute you're going to get somewhere, or many other examples. And then you say that these are going to that we're not going to be able to predict anymore when it comes to climate. And I think one question I have is, in a sense, wouldn't that be an ideal, that the predictive systems fail and thus scientific objective knowledge no longer controls so much of the world? So I just had that as a provocation.
Yeah, I mean, it's this ability to predict or calculate is failing in various ways. It unfortunately doesn't mean the future isn't going to happen. Like, and actually, the kind of the slightly weird thing I think about that with regard to the climate is not that, like, because our ability to predict the future is getting worse means that climate change isn't still going to be terrible. It means that maybe we hope we might be able to perform some kind of end run around the stupid fight we seem to be in of arguing about how bad it's going to be, right? Because this seems like a real waste of time. That actually, and it almost comes back to this question of the kind of burden of proof and evidence and kind of eyewitnessing or certain forms of evidentiary witnessing that we talked about earlier, that you know, instead of acting, we have this constant debate about how bad it's going to be, or trying to nail it down in this kind of computational form, which freezes our ability to act in the present. So, like, I don't see the kind of failure of prediction as meaning that, like, that everything falls away and that we have no idea what's going to happen, but it might actually, encourage us to act better now. Is always okay. We'll quickly take one more, or no?
There was one
we
more
done?
back here. Are you sure?
Well, I'm happy to talk more with everyone, but yes, let's stop.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.